The topic of this presentation is the how and why of combining active and passive organizational network analysis together. And just, for context, I'm the founder and CEO of Polinode. And I know there's been a lot of conversation, relatively recently about, the differences between active and passive organizational network analysis and the comparison between the two. What I wanted to do in this presentation is kind of take that conversation to the next step and talk about how we can use active and passive ONA together and get the benefits from both of them in the same kind of population. And there's four sections that I really want to talk to. The first is a bit of background and introduction. So I know that not everybody on this call, on this in this session will know what organizational network analysis is. So I just want to set the scene a little bit in terms of what is ONA, a little bit around what is Polinode as well, and then talk about the advantages and disadvantages of active versus passive ONA. And then go through kind of three examples for how we can combine active and passive ONA together. And then I just have a final thought on passive data as well at the end. So what do we mean by passive organizational network analysis? So passive organizational network analysis is really about using the digital exhaust that organizations naturally produce. So communication data, in order to understand how people are really working together. So the informal structure of organizations. And this is just a summary of the different data sources that Polinode uses. So we use email data, so Office 365 email data, calendar data, also Active Directory, so we can get the formal reporting structure if it exists in Active Directory as well. And more recently, we've added integrations with Microsoft Teams and Slack. So as part of the current environment, there's an increasing use of these tools as people kind of shift to a remote environment, and also more generally as well. So we now also support Microsoft Teams and Slack data as well. So that's what we mean by passive organizational network analysis. And active organizational network analysis is all about asking people questions about the relationships that they have in organizations. So here's an example of the types of questions that we ask people. So please identify up to 20 people in your organization who you work with on a regular basis and who help you be successful in your role. And we can typically pipe those questions to understand more about the nature of those relationships, the strengths of those relationships. But the key is it's about people nominating others and self-reporting relationships. That's what we mean by active organizational network analysis. And a little bit about what Polinode is Polinode is a tool or a platform for both active and passive organizational network analysis. So we can plug into all of those different data sources that I mentioned, and we can also collect relationship data via relationship-based surveys. So there's a fully integrated tool that's specifically designed for the collection of that kind of active ONA data. And regardless of the source, all of that data ends up as networks. And we have a networks tool that allows you to interactively visualize and analyze that data. So you can calculate different measures of centrality in the network. You can understand where the communities are, who are the people that bridge different groups. You can interactively color, size, filter, really interrogate and understand the informal structure of an organization. Key question, why do we use ONA? What are some of the use cases? So I'm just going to mention some of this very briefly for context. Things like identifying emerging talent, also supporting change management initiatives. So identifying influences is a key use case, and that gets used in a bunch of different ways, but one of them is change management. Succession planning. So if somebody leaves an organization and is replaced by somebody else, there's a lot of value in being able to understand the relationships of the predecessor in order to help the person who's assuming that role be as successful as possible, as fast as possible. Improving onboarding, so making sure that people are getting integrated into the network quickly and effectively. Also mergers and acquisitions integration. So as you're bringing two different organizations together, understanding where perhaps they are gelling and communicating strongly and where there might be issues, finding critical links, improving communication, and then a really important one that we've seen a lot of interest in, particularly in the US, promoting diversity and inclusion, and finally improving workplace layouts as well. So active versus passive ONA. So here I just want to talk a little bit about the advantages and disadvantages of active and passive ONA. Now that we know, a little bit about what we mean by passive ONA, we can understand that passive ONA, one of the advantages is that it doesn't require employee time, so it can be repeated more often. So when we plug into passive data sources, it's a near real-time update. So if we want to have a look at how things have changed this month versus last month, we can do that very easily, and so that's an important advantage of passive data. There's no issue with participation rates. So, and most organizations, will use email or enterprise social networks pretty much always. And so we get kind of full 100% coverage of respondents in most situations for the population. There's a somewhat greater degree of objectivity. So we're using, passive data, which is basically a record of the communication patterns. And we're not relying so much on nominations of individuals. But still, we will typically use thresholds in order to determine when a relationship exists or not. So there's still some degree of subjectivity, but there's certainly a greater degree of objectivity. You can easily integrate, so directly with Polinode, with Office 365 data, Teams data, Slack data. So it's just a matter of clicking a few buttons. It's quite easy to get the data in. Then historically, this has been quite a pain point for passive organizational network analysis, is accessing the data, but it's certainly a lot easier with direct integrations. Disadvantage, so passive ONA can create privacy perception issues and impact levels of trust with employees. So privacy is really important, and these are really important questions. And it's also related to information security. And so, there are obviously processes that need to be gone through, and that is something that because you don't have the active consent of respondents, just needs a fair bit more thought with passive data. There's less employee buy-in to results and willingness to share, so it's harder to use passive data to actively affect change, just because you're not bringing the individuals along with you as part of the process in most situations. And you cannot discriminate the nature of the connection, so you may miss behavioral influence as role models. So as we'll get into, active ONA has a real advantage in that you can drill in and really understand the nature and strength of relationships. And it's a lot harder to do that with passive data when you are typically recording the fact that the relationship exists. So active ONA, in contrast, allows for a much more nuanced and targeted view that can be aligned to the strategic purposes of the ONA. So if we want to focus on diversity and inclusion, we can ask questions around that. And we can also pull out data that understands, is there a knowledge relationship, is there an advice relationship, and so on. We can use the survey as a communication tool and a change intervention in itself, like I was saying, because the respondents come across as part of the process. There's a greater ability to be open about results. So, individual network reports are an important illustration of this. We can bring those respondents as part of the process, and we can show them where they sit in the overall network. And that can be one of the most effective ways of actually driving change, is showing people collaboration matrices and their position in individual network reports and how they compare to peers. There's no need to make a significant investment in terms of the IT connectivity. So this relates to that point I was making, information security and privacy. There's typically a process that needs to go through, and asking people, to self-report relationships means that it's easier to kind of navigate through that with active ONA than passive ONA. But it does require a time investment from respondents, and we know that people are typically time constrained, so we need to be aware of that. And you do need an explicit communication strategy to maximize the response rate. So, when ONAs are done well, there's an executive sponsor, there's involvement of HR business partners, there's reminders, etc. And all of that takes time and effort. And it's lower resolution. So, you don't want to do an active ONA, really, really often, right? But we have seen people run active ONAs every 12 to 24 months. So you're still able to do comparisons over time. But unlike passive data, you can't look at it, in near real time. And so I'm a data guy. So I'm, naturally attracted to the large amount of data that you get via passive ONA. But I think it's important to point out that, the human brain is this wonderful thing. And sometimes the right answer is to ask people questions, because that way we can kind of really understand and extract data, like I was saying, on the nuance and the strength and the type of relationships between people. So, for example, we can understand, is there a knowledge relationship? Does this person, give you knowledge or advice on how to do things? Are they a source of energy? Do they provide you with, inspiration and energy when you're doing your work? Also, innovation. So, who are the people that you would turn to if you had a new and innovative idea? Mentorship. So we can really track mentorship networks, and that too has important applications in terms of diversity and inclusion as well. And values. So, one of my favorite questions is to ask people to nominate, out of a list of 20 or 30, 3 values that they would like their organization to embrace going forward. And then as the very next question, to ask them, who best embraces those values today? And so, with active organizational network analysis, although it doesn't have all of the sexy kind of big to medium-sized data that passive does, there are these, real advantages in being able to understand things like knowledge and energy and innovation and so on. So the third section, combining active and passive ONA together. And so the main point that I want to make here is that 1 + 1 can be greater than 2. So in bringing active organizational network analysis and passive organizational network analysis together, we can sometimes achieve more, right? And so I want to kind of shift the conversation from being either active or passive to perhaps in some circumstances using both together. Why? Well, because we can still get the full population coverage that passive ONA provides us, but we can still obtain that detailed and nuanced data, things like knowledge and values and support and energy, through the active organizational network analysis. And we still have that active participation that allows us to bring people along with us as part of the process. But we can, at the same time, we can, drive change and also understand how that change is happening in kind of near real time, because we have the access to the passive data as well. So let me give you kind of 3 examples around how we can combine active and passive ONA together. So the first is around organizational design. And so when I've seen organizational design done well through organizational network analysis, it often starts with an active ONA, and it's an active ONA that asks questions not just about what relationships exist, but also what relationships people desire to exist. Who do you want greater access to? Who do you want to work more with in order to inform that formal structure? Because ultimately, that's what we're doing when we're using ONA for the purposes of organization design. And so that's often the first step. And then the second step is to take that data and to apply things like community detection algorithms, and also understanding and assessing, where are there pinch points or, high degrees of load in that organization, and informing that, not necessarily to completely redesign the formal structure, but using that to perhaps make some areas of the organization more aligned with the informal structure and kind of more agile in some respects. And so the point here is, after we make some of those changes, and this is some simulated data to give you an idea, we have a collaboration matrix that we can have a look at as a baseline using the passive data. So the way that you read this is that the row headings are the froms. This basically just means that 43.5% of the relationships from new team 1 come to new team 1 and 15.7 to new team 2 and so on. So this gives us a baseline, and then we can use the passive data to understand how things are changing and shifting over time. Which perhaps of these new teams are kind of gelling and working together, and where might there be areas where you might want to focus either in terms of how teams are collaborating or some individuals who might be kind of left behind in the new structure. Example 2. So, there's some really interesting research that demonstrates that a response rate greater than 70% is desirable for robust network metrics. The good news is that we typically achieve, response rates around 70 to 90%, often much higher than 90%. But even with those high response rates, it can be desirable to cautiously infer relationships from non-respondents from passive data. So what do I mean by that? Basically, I mean we can have a look at things like using graph-based machine learning to look at the people that didn't respond to the active ONA and essentially train on the active data with the passive data to infer relationships for the non-respondents, which then allow us to calculate network metrics that we otherwise wouldn't be able to, like betweenness centrality for the non-respondents. So that's a really interesting way of being able to combine the data as well. The third example is, I want to make the point that there is signal in the differences. So, relationships from passive data and active data typically correlate quite strongly, but there are definitely differences. But there are valuable insights in those differences because by definition, active data is subjective and passive data is objective. So it allows us to ask questions like, what are the characteristics of the individuals that tend to be more central in the passive data versus the active data? Does this differ by gender, by ethnicity, by location, by tenure, by role in ways that we wouldn't expect? And there's a lot of kind of interesting applications of this in the diversity and inclusion space as well, right? So just to give you an example, just to keep it simple, having a look at gender, and the horizontal axis here, this is all kind of anonymized data, but the horizontal axis is the percentile rank in terms of passive incoming connections. And the vertical axis is the percentile rank of active nominations. So if someone's on the 45-degree line, they kind of rank the same in terms of passive versus active. And if they're below that 45-degree line, they kind of rank higher in terms of passive than they do on active. So we get a correlation of about 0.62. But if we look here, we can see that below that 45-degree line, just visually, that there's a kind of a preponderance of females, right? So we have more females than we do males. And so females, just visually tend to rank higher on passive than they do on active, right? So in terms of higher in terms of when we look at the data from an objective standpoint versus how people report their nominations or relationships with others. And we can summarize that in terms of the average percentile difference. So, what we've done here is just taken an average for all the females and all the males, and we see that females rank about 5.5 percentiles lower in terms of their ranking on the self-nominations or the self-reported relationships than on the passive data. And males kind of rank 4.2% higher. And we see something very similar in terms of the senior. So, same delta and, the same kind of higher on passive than active for females at the senior levels as well. So the fourth section is just a final thought that I want to share around passive data. And we've spoken about the relationship between passive data and organizational network analysis. and that passive data kind of enables organizational network analysis. But it also enables, what I want to call the analysis of work patterns. And what do I mean by work patterns? I mean, it helps us to look at questions and answer questions like, using the data to look at send and receive times to understand people's workload outside of hours or on weekends. Answer questions like, how have work patterns changed over time, for example, with a shift to remote work? Are there particular groups under high load or at risk of overload? The ability for team members to have clear blocks of focus time in their calendar. The degree to which teams or groups are multitasking during meetings. Areas of the organization where regular one-on-ones with managers are happening and perhaps where they are not happening. And also, how do different work patterns like sending emails outside of work hours impact engagement? So what is the relationship between those two things? And this is a really new feature that we've just kind of released in Polinode just a few days ago. So we're effectively announcing it for the first time here at PAFOW. But we now allow for the export of all the raw kind of metadata that we collect for passive organizational network analysis. We allow for the export of that for the analysis of work pattern data, including timestamps. And that's local timestamps, so hour of the day as well as day of the week, and for all the different data sources as well, right? So for email data, calendar data, Teams data, Slack data, etc. And so the final thought on this is that there is this relationship between the analysis of this work pattern data and organizational network analysis. And so the one enriches the other. And so to give you an example of this, we can look at things like analyzing work patterns, send, receive times, overload, by informal communities that we detect via ONA, just as an example. And another example is that we can, ask questions like, how do the work patterns of cultural influences that we identify, via Active ONA, say, differ when compared to the rest of the organization? So we can look at, are these people, do they tend to spend more time in meetings? Are they tending to work outside of business hours? And how do the work patterns of the identified influences, and there's obviously different types of influences, right, that we can look at as well, but how do they differ from the rest of the organization? So if any of this is kind of interest to you, you'd like to learn about some of the other things that we're working on, and kind of some of the call it future plans and developments, please feel free to get in touch, info@polinode.com, or kind of find us at the virtual booth as well.
Andrew, thank you so much, and congratulations on what you've achieved there, because I personally am really interested in this notion of capacity and what activities are being engaged in remote work environments, particularly given that people have kids potentially, or elder parents, and we're getting taxed, and there's this pull between productivity and well-being. And it's like, hey, we still want people to work, we're paying them, but they got to take care of themselves. And what I'm seeing, what you're doing, is shedding light on that dynamic so leaders can take appropriate action. And in the absence of that, it's going to be hard to tell what they're truly doing. Is that a fair statement? And what would you advise if that's in fact the case?
Yeah, so I mean, absolutely. I mean, there's just so much value from the passive data in order to be able to kind of drill in and really understand those questions. And I think, there's also, I think there's, as I was saying, this ability to be able to not just use that passive data, but to combine it with, people's perceptions and understanding of others as well, right? Through the active organizational network analysis, asking people questions about, knowledge and, understanding, for example, not just whether we as an organization are overloaded, but, for example, are some of our linchpins in particular overloaded? I think those are kind of really interesting and important questions, particularly now.
Well, yeah, again, congratulations. We're going to definitely spend more time together because I want to go deeper into your product, and we'll get that done either in the podcast form or go through a demo of your product. Because again, I'm certainly a fan not only of this concept of ONA, which really sheds light on how people are spending their time, but how you're approaching it, which is a very ethical, responsible way of looking at this. So thank you for doing what you do, and we'll catch up soon. Yeah.
Thanks, Al.